Venezuela. A name that dominates today's headlines, yet how many of us truly understand this South American nation? As recent events unfold, it's more important than ever to step back and understand where Venezuela is, who its people are, and how centuries of history have led to this moment. This is the story of a land blessed with extraordinary natural wealth, yet cursed by the complications that wealth can bring. A nation of revolutionary heroes and complex modern struggles. A country whose fate has been intertwined with global powers for over 5 centuries. Part 1. The land and its people. Let's begin with geography. Venezuela sits on the northern coast of South America, bordered by Colombia to the west, Brazil to the south, and Guyana to the east. Its northern coast stretches along the Caribbean Sea for nearly 2,800 kilometers. The country covers roughly 916,000 square kilometers, about twice the size of California. But Venezuela isn't just one landscape. It's a nation of remarkable geographic diversity. In the northwest, you'll find the Maracaibo Basin, home to Lake Maracaibo, one of the largest lakes in South America. To the north lie the Venezuelan Andes, part of the great mountain chain that runs down South America's spine. Central Venezuela features vast grasslands called the Llanos, endless plains that flood in the rainy season and bake dry under the sun. And in the south, the Guyana highlands rise up with ancient Tepuy Mountains, including Angel Falls, the world's highest uninterrupted waterfall. The capital, Caracas, sits in a valley near the northern coast, home to millions of Venezuelans. Other major cities include Maracaibo in the oil-rich west, Valencia in the industrial heartland, and Barquisimeto in the northwest. Venezuela's population today stands at around 28 million, though millions have emigrated in recent years. The people are a rich mestizo mix: indigenous peoples, Spanish colonizers, African slaves, and later immigrants from Italy, Portugal, Germany, and the Middle East have all contributed to Venezuela's cultural tapestry. Part 2. Indigenous peoples and Spanish conquest. Before European contact, Venezuela was home to diverse indigenous groups. The Caribs lived along the coast, fierce warriors and skilled sailors. The Arawaks inhabited the western regions. The Tomotocuicas built terraced farms in the Andean highlands. These weren't primitive societies. They had complex social structures, trade networks, and agricultural systems. In 1498, Christopher Columbus arrived during his third voyage, becoming the first European to reach the South American mainland. The name Venezuela came the following year, when Spanish explorers Alonso de Ojeda and Amerigo Vespucci saw indigenous stilt houses built over Lake Maracaibo. It reminded them of Venice, Italy, so they called it Veneziola, Little Venice. But here's the cruel irony: the Spanish came seeking gold and found little. Unlike the silver mines of Peru or the gold of Mexico, Venezuela didn't offer immediate mineral wealth. This meant Spanish colonization proceeded differently here. Without rich mines, the colony developed around agriculture: cacao, tobacco, and coffee plantations. And plantations meant one thing: slavery. The Spanish established a rigid colonial society. At the top stood Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Spain. Below them came Criollos, people of Spanish descent born in the Americas. They owned the land but were excluded from the highest positions of power. Then came mestizos, people of mixed indigenous and European heritage. At the bottom of this hierarchy, enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples forced into labor systems called encomiendas. This social structure would prove crucial to understanding Venezuela's independence movement. For nearly 3 centuries, Venezuela remained a relative backwater of the Spanish Empire, administratively part of the Viceroyalty of New Granada. But by the late 1700s, ideas from the Enlightenment and the American and French revolutions were filtering into the Americas, and the Criollo elite was growing restless. Part 3. The Liberator and Independence. The story of Venezuelan independence is inseparable from one man, Simón Bolívar. Born in 1783 into one of Caracas's wealthiest Criollo families, Bolívar was orphaned young and educated in Europe, where he absorbed Enlightenment philosophy. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808, creating a power vacuum in the Spanish Empire, Bolívar saw his moment. On April 19, 1810, Venezuelan Criollos in Caracas established a junta, nominally loyal to the deposed Spanish king but effectively autonomous. 1 year later, on July 5, 1811, Venezuela declared absolute independence, the first South American colony to do so. But independence wouldn't come easily. What followed was over a decade of brutal warfare. The conflict wasn't just Venezuelans against Spain. It was a complex civil war with racial, class, and regional dimensions. The Spanish crown recruited freed slaves and indigenous peoples by promising them liberty, pitting them against the Criollo revolutionaries. The Plains Cowboys, the Llaneros, under the fierce leadership of José Antonio Páez, eventually switched to Bolívar's side, providing crucial military support. Bolívar himself suffered devastating defeats. The First Republic collapsed by 1812. The Second Republic fell in 1814. He was forced into exile, sailing between Caribbean islands and Colombia, writing revolutionary manifestos and planning his return. The tide finally turned at the Battle of Carabobo on June 24, 1821. Bolívar's forces decisively defeated the Spanish, securing Venezuelan independence. By 1823, the last Spanish forces had been expelled. Gran Colombia was born, a republic encompassing modern-day Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, and Ecuador. Bolívar became its president. His lieutenant Antonio José de Sucre continued liberating territories to the south, and for a brief moment, the dream seemed real. But it wasn't to last. Regional tensions, economic problems, and political rivalries tore Gran Colombia apart. By 1830, Venezuela had seceded, becoming an independent nation. Bolívar, the liberator, died that same year in Colombia, disillusioned and in exile, reportedly saying, "I have plowed the sea." Venezuela's first 4 decades of independence were marked by instability, a succession of caudillos, regional strongmen who ruled through military force and personal charisma. The country's wealth remained in the hands of a small elite, while most Venezuelans remained poor. Part of 4. Oil changes everything. For most of the 19th century, Venezuela's economy relied on agriculture, coffee, and cacao exports. But in the early 20th century, everything changed. In 1914, the first commercial oil well was drilled in the Maracaibo Basin. By the 1920s, Venezuela had become a major oil exporter. And by the 1950s, Venezuela was the world's 4th largest economy and the 2nd largest oil exporter after the United States. Oil wealth transformed Venezuela. Roads, bridges, hospitals, and schools were built. Caracas grew into a gleaming modern city with ambitious modernist architecture. Immigrants flooded in from war-torn Europe and the Middle East. Venezuela became the richest country in Latin America. But this wealth came with a curse, the resource curse, or Dutch disease, as economists call it. When a country becomes dependent on a single commodity, everything else suffers. Agriculture declined as rural workers moved to oil fields and cities. The currency strengthened, making other exports uncompetitive. Economic planning became tied to volatile oil prices, and most dangerously, oil money concentrated immense power in the hands of whoever controlled the state. During the 1950s, Venezuela experienced the dictatorship of Marcos Pérez Jiménez, who used oil revenues to build grand infrastructure projects while crushing political opposition. He was overthrown in 1958, and Venezuela transitioned to democracy. The Punto Fijo Pact of 1958 established a power-sharing agreement between Venezuela's main political parties. For the next 40 years, Venezuela was one of Latin America's most stable democracies, with regular elections and peaceful transfers of power. Presidents from the centrist Democratic Action Party and the center-right COPE party alternated in office. But there were problems beneath the surface. Oil wealth wasn't reaching ordinary Venezuelans. Despite being one of the richest countries in the region, poverty remained widespread. Corruption was endemic. Oil revenues enriched politicians and their cronies while public services deteriorated. The political system felt closed, with the same elite families and party structures controlling everything. The crisis came to a head in 1989. Facing a fiscal crisis, President Carlos Andrés Pérez implemented IMF-recommended austerity measures and market reforms. On February 27, protests against rising transportation costs in Caracas exploded into massive riots known as the Caracazo. The government responded with military force. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, were killed. It was a breaking point in Venezuelan history, the moment when the old political order lost legitimacy in the eyes of many Venezuelans. Part 5. The Bolivarian Revolution. Into this crisis stepped a former paratrooper named Hugo Chávez. In 1992, Chávez, then a lieutenant colonel, led a failed military coup against President Pérez. He was imprisoned, but became a folk hero to many Venezuelans tired of corruption and inequality. When he appeared on television to call for his co-conspirators to surrender, he said, for now, their objectives hadn't been met. That Pora Hora became his rallying cry. Released in 1994, Chávez formed a political movement. He spoke directly to Venezuela's poor majority in a way no politician had in decades. He invoked Simón Bolívar constantly, calling his movement the Bolivarian Revolution. He promised to use Venezuela's oil wealth for the people, not the elite. In December 1998, Chávez was elected president with 56% of the vote. Chávez's early years in power brought significant changes. He rewrote the constitution, expanding presidential powers and renaming the country the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. He launched social programs called missions, providing healthcare, education, and food subsidies to poor communities, often funded directly by oil revenues. When oil prices skyrocketed in the 2000s, reaching historic highs, Chávez had immense resources to implement his vision. Literacy programs, free healthcare clinics in poor neighborhoods, housing projects. Millions of Venezuelans saw their lives improve. Chávez was wildly popular among the poor and working class. But there was another side to his governance. Chávez centralized power, weakening democratic institutions. He used oil revenues to reward supporters and punish opponents. Private media outlets critical of his government faced harassment. He expropriated private businesses, often without compensation or clear plans for operation. His economic policies, including price controls and currency restrictions, created distortions that would later prove disastrous. On the international stage, Chávez positioned himself as a leader of anti-American resistance in Latin America. He formed alliances with Cuba, selling oil at subsidized prices in exchange for Cuban doctors and advisors. He befriended leaders like Bolivia's Evo Morales and Ecuador's Rafael Correa. He cozied up to Iran's Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and Russia's Vladimir Putin. He regularly criticized U.S. foreign policy and imperialism, calling President George W. Bush the devil at the United Nations. The United States, in turn, viewed Chávez with hostility. In 2002, a coup briefly removed Chávez from power. He accused the U.S. of supporting the coup, accusations the U.S. denied, but which many in Venezuela believed. Chávez survived and emerged politically stronger. When Chávez died of cancer in 2013, his chosen successor, Nicolás Maduro, a former bus driver and union organizer, became president. But Maduro inherited a country whose problems were about to explode. Part 6. Collapse and Crisis. Nicolás Maduro lacked Chávez's charisma and political skill. More importantly, he took office just as oil prices began a catastrophic decline. And the economic model Chávez had built, dependent almost entirely on high oil prices and centralized control, collapsed. Venezuela's economic crisis has been one of the worst peacetime economic collapses in modern history. Hyperinflation reached levels that rivaled Zimbabwe and Weimar Germany. In 2018, inflation was estimated at over 1 million%. The Bolivar, Venezuela's currency, became worthless. People carried shopping bags full of cash to buy bread. Food and medicine disappeared from stores. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies. Diseases that had been eliminated, like malaria and measles, returned. Crime spiraled out of control. Millions of Venezuelans fled the country. Estimates suggest over 7 million have emigrated since 2015, creating the second-largest refugee crisis in the world after Syria. How did this happen? It wasn't just oil prices. Years of economic mismanagement came home to roost. Price controls created shortages. Currency controls and expropriations drove away investment. PDVSA, the state oil company, was gutted by corruption and political appointments of unqualified loyalists. Oil production, which had been around 3 million barrels per day in the late 1990s, fell below 500,000 barrels per day. Maduro's government became increasingly authoritarian as it lost legitimacy. Elections were manipulated. The opposition-controlled National Assembly was stripped of power and replaced with a constituent assembly packed with Maduro loyalists. Opposition leaders were jailed or exiled. Protests were met with violence. The 2018 presidential election was widely condemned as fraudulent. Most opposition parties boycotted. International observers weren't allowed. Maduro was declared the winner, but few outside his core supporters believed it was a fair election. This set up a constitutional crisis. In January 2019, Juan Guaidó, the president of the National Assembly, declared himself interim president, arguing that Maduro's election was illegitimate. Over 50 countries, including the United States and most of Europe and Latin America, recognized Guaidó. But other countries, Russia, China, Cuba, Iran, Turkey, continued supporting Maduro. Venezuela effectively had two governments, though Maduro retained control of the military and the state. International sanctions intensified Venezuela's crisis. The United States imposed harsh sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry and targeted individuals in Maduro's government. These sanctions aimed to pressure Maduro to step down, but critics argued they made life worse for ordinary Venezuelans without achieving regime change. Part 7. Why the United States cares. Venezuela's relationship with the United States has been complex throughout history, but oil has always been at the center. Venezuela sits just 1,600 kilometers from U.S. shores. During World War II, Venezuelan oil fueled the Allied war effort. Throughout the Cold War, Venezuela was a stable, democratic, pro-American country in a region often marked by instability and dictatorship. U.S. oil companies invested heavily in Venezuela. But that relationship soured under Chávez. His anti-American rhetoric, his alliances with U.S. adversaries, and his nationalizing of oil operations created tensions. When Chávez sold oil to Cuba at subsidized rates, strengthened ties with Iran, and welcomed Russian military cooperation, U.S. policymakers grew alarmed. Here's something crucial to understand. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, even larger than Saudi Arabia. In total, Venezuela's reserves are estimated at around 300 billion barrels. These reserves are heavy crude, difficult and expensive to extract, but they're there. Control of these reserves matters enormously in global energy markets. There's also the question of regional influence. The United States has long viewed Latin America through the lens of the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the Western Hemisphere is America's sphere of influence, and that foreign powers shouldn't meddle here. When Russia and China increased their presence in Venezuela, offering billions in loans and investment, it challenged U.S. dominance in the region. Additionally, Venezuela's collapse created humanitarian consequences that directly affected the United States. Millions of Venezuelan refugees fled to neighboring countries, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Chile. Hundreds of thousands made their way through Central America and Mexico to the U.S. southern border. The Trump administration took an increasingly hard line on Venezuela. They recognized Juan Guaidó as the legitimate president, imposed extensive sanctions, and repeatedly hinted at possible military intervention, though direct military action never materialized during Trump's first term. Other factors also played into U.S. concerns. Drug trafficking routes running through Venezuela, accusations that the Maduro government was involved in the drug trade, reports of terrorist groups operating in Venezuelan territory, and concerns about Chinese and Russian military equipment and advisors in Venezuela. But it's important to note, perspectives on Venezuela vary widely. Many on the political left in Latin America and beyond see U.S. actions as imperialist intervention, an attempt to control Venezuela's oil and overthrow a government that challenged American hegemony. Many on the right see a humanitarian crisis and a dictatorship that needs to be removed. The truth, as often happens, is complex and contested. Part 8. Recent escalation and the path to military action. The situation escalated dramatically through 2025. After years of sanctions and diplomatic pressure failing to dislodge Maduro, the second Trump administration adopted a more aggressive approach. Starting in September 2025, the U.S. conducted strikes on vessels in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, claiming they were connected to drug trafficking. In November, the U.S. deployed the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford to the region. In December, the administration began seizing Venezuelan oil tankers and imposing a naval blockade. The Trump administration designated 2 Venezuelan gangs as foreign terrorist organizations and claimed that one was led by Maduro himself. This designation appeared to be laying legal groundwork for military action without congressional authorization. On December 30, 2025, Trump announced that the U.S. had bombed a docking facility on Venezuela's coast, allegedly used for drug trafficking. No evidence was provided for this claim. It was the first confirmed U.S. strike on Venezuelan territory. Then, in the early hours of January 3, 2026, the United States launched a large-scale military operation. Over 150 aircraft participated. Helicopters from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment carried Delta Force soldiers into Caracas. Targets included the Tiuna Fort Military Complex, the La Carlota Air Base, and other military installations. The operation, codenamed Absolute Resolve, resulted in the capture of President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. They were flown to New York to face charges related to narco-terrorism. President Trump announced that the United States would run Venezuela until a transition of power could occur. He expressed interest in U.S. companies gaining access to Venezuela's oil industry. The Venezuelan government, led by Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, condemned the attack as an illegal act of aggression and a violation of the UN Charter. She declared that Venezuela would never be anyone's colony and demanded Maduro's release. International reaction has been divided. Some countries, particularly U.S. allies, have supported or remained silent. Others, including Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Cuba, Russia, and China, have condemned the strikes as a violation of international law and Venezuelan sovereignty. And so here we are. A country with 500 years of history, indigenous civilizations, Spanish conquest, revolutionary liberation, oil wealth and oil curse, democracy and dictatorship, prosperity and collapse. Now at perhaps its most uncertain moment. Venezuela's story is uniquely Venezuelan, yet it touches on themes that resonate worldwide. The resource curse, the tension between democracy and authoritarianism, the lasting effects of colonialism, the power of nationalist movements, the complexities of U.S. foreign policy, and the question of when, if ever, military intervention is justified. Whatever your perspective on recent events, whether you see them as a liberation or an invasion, as a humanitarian intervention or imperialism, as the end of a dictatorship or a violation of sovereignty. Venezuela's story reminds us that history is never simple, that geopolitics is always complex, and that real human lives hang in the balance of these grand narratives. The Venezuelan people who have endured so much, colonial exploitation, civil wars, dictatorship, economic collapse, and now foreign intervention, deserve a future of peace, prosperity, and self-determination. What that future looks like remains to be seen. Thank you for listening.